what you're actually made of in many ways. That what informs you, what you're made of, is what you encounter when you voluntarily encounter the unknown. And so the more you voluntarily encounter the unknown, the more you get made of. And the more you get made of, the more there is to you. And then the more you're good at encountering the unknown and restructuring order and calling forth proper order out of the potential of being. And God, you got to think, why wouldn't you do that since you can do that? And it's an endless mystery. You know, I think part of it is that people, well, it's also encapsulated to some degree in the story of Adam and Eve, because what happens to Adam is when he becomes self-conscious, right? He becomes ashamed of himself and regards himself as a lowly sort of creature. And there's endless reasons why people would do that, because of course we're rife with imperfection, and so he hides from God. And I think that's actually the answer to the conundrum, which is that people don't aspire to the highest good because they're deeply ashamed of themselves and their weaknesses and their insufficiencies. And so that's not the only reason. I mean, there's the desire to avoid responsibility, and there's all the negative motivations as well, like resentment and hatred and the desire to make things worse. I don't want to, give us too much of a break, but it's something like that. But it's okay to not be in a very good place if what you're trying to do with that not very good place is make it better. And one of the things I really have learned as a clinical psychologist is that you just cannot believe how powerful incremental progress is. You can do the calculations it's like compound interest, If you make your life 0.1% better a week, man, in 2 or 3 years, you're in such a better place than you were that it isn't even like the same domain. And if you keep that up for 10 years or 20 years, especially if you're young and you start early, you start to straighten yourself out and fix the things that you can fix, you can transform your lives in ways that are completely unimaginable. And God only knows what the upper limit of that is in terms of human possibility, because we are amazing creatures, when we really get our act together and stop running at 10% of our capacity, So that's what you do. You've got, the fact that things aren't exactly the way they should be at least gives you something to do, and that's maybe something great to do, because there's no shortage of suffering and trouble that besets the world that you could conceivably ameliorate in some way. And the utility and meaning, the utility of that and the intrinsic meaning of that is self-evident. So it also makes me curious about nihilism, for example, and despair, because I understand those emotions, I understand them deeply, and the intellectual mindset that goes along with it, but they just seem beside the point to me in some sense, because there are so many things that need doing that all you really have to do is open your eyes and look at them and then decide that you're actually going to do something about them. And you might think, well, what's within my scope of influence is so trivial that it's not worth doing. It's like, it won't stay trivial for long if you do it. Not at all, and I don't think it's trivial to begin with. I really don't believe that anything done right is trivial. And my experience in my life has been that anything I actually did paid off. It didn't pay off necessarily in the way that I expected it to pay off. That's a whole different story. But if it was genuine commitment to do something, even if it went sideways and the outcome was really something other than what I expected, the net consequence over time was nothing but good. One of the things you do in behavior therapy constantly is you help people calibrate the zone of proximal development. So imagine that's Vygotsky's term, right? And so if you're in the zone of proximal development, you're pushing your skill development one increment forward. And it's one that you can actually manage. And so if you see people who are entirely stymied, we're sort of back to the cup of coffee or the coffee cup example, you want to find something they can do locally this week that would constitute at least a micro win. And you just keep, and if you talk to someone, you say, well, why don't you try cleaning up your room? Because it's a complete catastrophic nightmare. It's a good place to start. And this is often the case with people who are really demoralized and whose life is utterly chaotic. And maybe they come back later and say, well, I had one client, he just had a child, and he didn't want to mess up this child, but he was living at home. He was like 35 years old. He had a child out of wedlock by accident, but he didn't want to be a useless father, and he was very afraid he was going to be. And he had good reason to. Like, he still lived at home. He lived in his high school bedroom, and it was a complete bloody mess. He was living like a 12-year-old, a bad 12-year-old. And so I said, well, when was the last time that your carpet was vacuumed? And he said, well, sometimes my mother does it, but it's probably been months. I said, well, why don't you just bring the vacuum cleaner into the room and just vacuum your carpet. That'll be your task for this week. And I knew that was a bigger task than you might think, because he'd been in that room for like 18 years and it was a mess. And so cleaning it up at all was a big deal. He told me that he dragged that bloody vacuum cleaner into the doorway and left it 45 degrees across the doorway and then stepped over it for the whole week without actually using it.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah, resistance, that was resistance from a psychoanalytic perspective, because he saw the monster and was paralyzed. And so what we did was we reduced the task. I said, look, you've got some drawers in your bureau. They're probably a mess. Do you have a sock drawer? Yes. He said, clean up 1/2 of the sock drawer this week. That's it, just organize it. So you just keep cutting the tasks down week by week until you find the threshold for positive movement forward. And then what's cool about that too is there's a Pareto principle issue associated with it. So if you can find out where the person can start, it isn't linear progress, it's exponential progress forward. And so even if they have to start at a micro level, it doesn't really matter, because they get much better at it very, very rapidly as they accrue successes. When you fall into anxiety, then there is this internal obsessiveness, which has to do with the panoply of sins in some sense. Which parts of me are malfunctioning and need to be eradicated? And one of the things I used to do with my socially anxious clients, so they would go into a social situation, often with eyes downcast, by the way, and they would be so intensely concentrating on their own internal sensations that they would fail to make eye contact with anybody they were talking to. And then they would be awkward because they weren't reading the cues they could have read if they would have only looked. And then the conversation would become disjointed, and then they would get anxious and fall into themselves, and then it would just spiral.
I see.
And so one of the things that I taught them to do wasn't to try to calm themselves down, but to try to calm the other person down. So when you go into a social situation, pay more attention to the other person. Just focus your attention outward. And if the person had any social skill, sometimes I had clients who had no social skills. And so they were anxious socially because they actually didn't know how to behave socially. So then you had to teach them the social skills. But some of them had the skills but wouldn't activate them because they were so neurotically obsessed with their own inadequacy that they failed to attend to the cues that would elicit the proper responses. And all they had to learn to do was watch. And then they would automatically respond because they knew how to have a conversation.
This brings us to some of the practical tools that I think my laboratory has been working on, which is, many people have heard about the utility of mindfulness meditation, which most typically is close your eyes, focus on third eye center, your breathing, bring your awareness to your so-called interoception. Perception can be interoceptive from the skin inward or exteroceptive to the world outward. The data are showing that people who are overly socially anxious, for instance, they are too much in touch with their bodily signals. In fact, they can count their own heartbeats without taking their pulse with their finger, which is a is a great indicator of how interoceptively aware you are. Those people would probably be best to avoid inward focusing meditations.
Well, it's hard to say, because there may be a variable there that's relevant. See, the reason that socially anxious people are so interoceptive is it's involuntary. Right? They get gripped by the negative emotion, and then that produces this intense, obsessive interoception. That might not happen if they did it voluntarily.
I see.
Because you're going to activate an entire different system, the one you already talked about. This is why exposure therapy works so well in psychotherapy. Is I'm afraid of something, and if I go near it, then I'm possessed by negative emotion. Well, that's if you go near it accidentally. I'm going to have you go near it purposefully. And what you're going to find is that to the degree that you do it purposefully, that response will be quelled. See, if you do that repeatedly with people, not only do they stop being afraid of the things that you're showing them, that you're exposing them to, but they become more likely to approach other things they're afraid of, far more likely. In fact, it doesn't exactly look like people get less afraid at all. It looks like what happens is they learn to get braver.